is a senior lecturer at the Université Sorbonne Paris Nord, and she has published many articles about Rushdie and South Asian writers. She edited Continuité, Conservatisme, Classicisme dans les littératures postcoloniales, published by Presse Universitaire de Rennes in 2013, and more recently, in 2020, the issue Exception of Commonwealth Essays and Studies. She's currently working on Rushdie's late style, as well as developing various projects in creative writing, in English and in French, to tell us about humor, trauma, and the writing of history in Homebound by Puja Changoiwala.
Thank you for this presentation. And thank you to the organizers and to Puja for being here today. As I said to you earlier, it's a bit intimidating to give a paper on a work with in presence of its author, but it's also very exciting. Since this will be the second paper on Homebound, I won't go into the details of plot and context. What I'd like to do here is to address the literary composition of the book and to try to evaluate how the narrative voice conveys a form to a subject matter that's elusive and problematic. Are we talking about fact or fiction? Are the issues over and done with? Can we trust a child? To do that, I will first discuss the genre of the book and the status of the child narrator. Then I'll define the satirical tone and how it widens the range of representation. And I'll finish with some notes on the limits of satire in the face of trauma and of the task of writing a piece of history. The girl narrator in Homebound says she writes to a seasoned journalist, Ms. Farrar, the persona of the author, Puja Changoiwala, who's herself a seasoned journalist used to conducting interviews and investigations in that area. Each of the 11 letters corresponds to a stage in the family's exodus to Rajasthan. They're given a short title, most of them a one-word title, like Farewell, Wildwood, or Home, in an attempt to pinpoint a stage within this dangerous passage. The effect of this title is to generalize those stages, to convey meaning in a didactic way. Thus, they strip the letters of their sheer communication function and place them onto another plane, that of tale or myth. In addition to the letters, a two-page afterword accounts for the girl's death and the fate of the notebook used to write the letters, which her mother places in her grave. It's followed by a longer author's note, which establishes the conditions of writing and the specific status of fiction in Homebound. So thanks to this embedded structure, the book can be viewed as the literary repository or shroud of an artifact standing for a human life. Now, if we look at the content of the novel, this is a peculiar epistolary novel because there's no exchange, no actual reply. The book reads more like a diary, which is confirmed by the practical mention of a notebook. The use of the second person feels like an apostrophe to an imaginary pen pal in a fantasy correspondence. And in the absence of a dialogue, the narrative creates an immediate intimacy that is demanding. From the outset, the reader is given the role of the addressee in absentia and is thus summoned to react. It's a diary of a teenager that could be written anywhere in the world at any given point in history, and it made me think about Anne Frank and her imaginary friend, Kitty. Both narrators place themselves and their intimate world at the center, with the dramatic context working as backdrop. In Homebound, Mayhair is in awe of a chosen idol, and she chose her because of her alleged gifts of compassion and understanding, in a more or less classic case of transference. Compassion and understanding that she hasn't found in her immediate environment and that she fantasizes about. What emanates from her voice is a universal longing for individual expression in the long tradition of coming-of-age female narratives, such as Anne Frank's again, but also in other genres the classics by Harper Lee or Carson McCullers, despite their differences, obviously. To go back to the nature of the letters, they create demands on readers. The desire to communicate relies upon acknowledging the presence of another character. It thus inscribes the narrative in the present time, even though the impossible dialogue defines the experience of the narrator as untimely and spectral. The monological form of the unanswered letters creates a bridge between the now of the reading and the I of the speaking subject, thereby leaving its stamp on the present. As the reader progresses in the book, this impact gets more and more intense, even violent, but so is the absence of response, which feels like an SOS. Little by little, and all the way to the end, the author of the letters emerges as utterly, literally helpless. The 11 letters allow the reader to glimpse into what we might call a typical extended Indian family, composed of 3 generations, with its subtle games of preferences and affiliations. On a superficial level, the members of the family seen through the eyes of the teenagers are types, even caricatures. The optimistic Uncle Proton is married to the pessimistic Electron Auntie. The younger brother is his mother's favorite and is called Happy. Other secondary characters outside the family are also referred to by way of nicknames. Twitter Uncle is a local celebrity who gets things done by posting his neighbor's problems on the social media platform, thus managing in his own personal way to solve state inaction. The shortcuts created by the nicknames and the characterization that is reduced to a minimum are reminiscent of the playfulness of children trying to make sense of their environment. The nicknames also echo the parodic dimension of the book. The genre of the fairy tale is hinted at here and there, in particular in the incipit. The first line of the first letter reads as, I quote, "It was a fairy dressed in white, the tear gas bomb. She descended upon the earth with a golden explosion and serenaded it with her confetti, little diamond-like droplets that smelled like spices and burnt like the earth's core." Later on, the little brother is depicted as Tom Thumb in the wood, scattering bits of paper during their escape and remembering the tales his sister had told him in Mumbai. Parodying fairy tales enhances the actual horror the family is going through. The opening scene, picturing the dousing of toxic products onto the population by the authorities, is followed by a series of atrocities. Little elves were, in fact, I quote, police officers with wooden batons for magic wands. The constitutive elements of the tale are placed upside down with fairies turned into devils, and this liberates a potential for horror. Like in fairy tales, anything becomes possible. Even when the subject matter is lighter, the characterization that relies on playful associations and caricatures reveals more than meets the eye. Page 47, for example, the narrator comments on the way her uncle addresses her aunt using the suffix G, which in India is a mark of politeness added at the end of a name. I quote, "Over the years, I had noticed that the suffix was uncle's involuntary defense mechanism, which came into play every time his wife threatened to destroy their intra-atomic stability." End of quote. The child catches the slight variations in the way people speak to one another and is thus able to grasp the more significant dangers looming over the family's stability. As much as the reader enjoys the family comedy based on types, there is indeed more to the superficial layer of social interaction viewed from a child's perspective. We learn in due time, for example, that the story of the uncle-aunt couple is entangled in the communal tragedy of Hindu-Muslim hatred. There are other numerous examples in Homebound where adult stories are superimposed over the sheer comedy of the child's overview. I'm thinking of short but vivid scenes depicting a farmer's plight, the kiln worker's ordeal, or dying people on the road. The narrative moves on by enveloping or contaminating the child's worldview without suppressing it completely. The letters stand out because they're written in the strong voice of a smart individual who still has one foot in childhood, and this feature enables the author to offer at once a fresh, candid outlook and a more profound take on serious matter. The transition that the narrator undergoes from childhood to adulthood at the very moment of writing those letters is particularly apt to convey the sense of crisis inherent to the exodus at the art of Homebound. The narrator stands at this crossroads between the innocence of early childhood and the greater intelligence of a teenager who really starts thinking and reasoning. This pivotal position turns out to be efficient narratively. The author seldom misses the marks in terms of tone, scenes, and interaction between characters. Thanks to this likable rebel's voice, Homebound is a novel that advocates the underdog, but a novel that manages to avoid sweeping statements on poverty nonetheless. Describing big city slums has become a staple of Indian novels since the 1980s. Homebound made me think of Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance, Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Arvind Adiga's White Tiger, etc., because of the way those texts treat such problems as police corruption, slum life, deceit, and exploitation, especially of children. Thanks to those books, the Indian urban life is now familiar to readers all over the world, and yet it resists our comprehension because it's so complex and shifting, as this recent novel points out. What makes Homebound so compelling and morally interesting in a way that A Fine Balance is not, for example, is the humor. I was amazed by that when I first read it. The ability of the narrator to break open the contradictions and injustices of both family life and politics, thanks to satire. The letters contain acute criticism of everything, basically, as you would expect criticism coming from a teenager. Speaking of experience. Meher is relentless about family life, especially when it comes to religion and superstitious beliefs that shape everyday life. The girl belittles both her mother and her grandmother because of their absurd rites. I quote, "My mother believes in amulets more than she does in evolution, and she has tied black threads around all of Happy's limbs, even his neck." Happy being the nickname of the younger brother, who's also the darling of the mother. Or, after they momentarily escape danger on the road, the mother, I quote, thanks every supernatural avatar she could recollect, the deities and demigods, gods of the 5 elements, celestial celebrities, and ghosts of dead ancestors. The absurdity of superstitious behaviors is equated with that of the lockdown, as if fiction had been paralleled and outperformed by reality. The women's belief in Kali, for example, that is the final epoch of civilization according to Hindu theology, is voiced by the grandmother each time the girl does something bad. Eventually, it makes her wonder about those predictions, which are not that far from the dystopia they're experiencing on the road. I quote, "I never agree with Grandma, but many of those dark age predictions ring true for the contemporary world. Weather and environment will degrade, famines and droughts will be common, diseases will spread, political leaders will consume citizens, thieves will become kings, kings will become thieves, filling the belly will become the goal of life." This is perhaps one of the most prominent features of this voice. It's witty, ironic, and in the end, it turns out to be devastatingly efficient when it addresses superstition as one of the national evils. When lockdown was announced in India, the decision were at once authoritarian and based on facts that were not backed by much science, much like everywhere else in the world at the beginning, but it grew worse in India. The author, in a few pages, relates the ways in which pseudoscience and superstitious beliefs literally took center stage in India. Page 5, the narrator describes the order to light candles for 9 minutes at 9 p.m. issued by Prime Minister Modi to activate, I quote, cosmic energy to defeat the virus. The announcement was famously followed by a deluge of viral fake news based on, I quote, the brilliant numerology of the Honorable PM and other so-called strategies to defeat the virus, from lighting candles to eating cow dung. The girl is outraged by such all-encompassing superstition that overcame the whole country and not only her mother and grandmother. The novel is interspersed with a not so subtle criticism of the Modi government and of the overwhelming pressure of Hindu fundamentalists. The criticism, again, is more effective because that very language resonates so well with a child's mind. In a way, the political discourse, irrational as it sounds, based on wishful thinking, is placed at the level of a child's belief in magic. It's ironic that the mother believes that the narrator, her own daughter, doesn't need any protective talisman. Contrary to her, she says, the evil needs protection from her because she talks back so much. She can, she can chase demons away with her words. Fortunately for her, the little girl can turn to a wiser, rational grandfather who claims that superstition is indeed one of the, I quote, oldest citadels of prejudice in India. In a Voltairean rant, he goes on to condemn sadhus, those Hindu priests who manipulate religion and its text, weave falsehoods around them, all for cash. They're hawking superstitions, peddling myths for money, and using God as their tool to build prisons of ignorance. Taking her cue from her grandfather, the teenager rebels against practices that isolate menstruating women from the rest of the community in villages, and she resents her own mother's feeling when she treats her like a pariah every month when she has her period. And she also resents going back to the village because she knows that women there are not as free as they are in Mumbai. Her willingness to question and her eagerness to find mentor figures, such as her school mistress in Mumbai, speaks volume of this universal longing for girls in particular, for growing up and feeling empowered. Her dream of journalism is fueled by what she's noticed all around her all her life. She adds, I quote, my specialization would be science, as our country needs scientific temper more than all else right now, more than even temples and cows. She wants to elevate public awareness and knowledge, infantilized as it is by irrational and superstitious discourse that fosters nothing but fascism. As it unfolds, the journey, which started out not lightheartedly, but at least with some degree of hope and a good deal of energy, takes on a dramatic turn. The turning point can be identified in the death of the Muslim family befriended along the way. The girl narrator is at first particularly excited by the new friendship with the daughter, who soon becomes an older sister figure. But at some point, the Muslim family decides to stop because the elder siblings have trouble walking and they make the wrong choice of staying along the rail tracks, thinking that trains do not circulate during lockdown. They're caught in their sleep by a speeding freight train and die on the spot. This key event sheds a black veil over the narrator, who will never be able to get over it. The humor, distance, and irony that make the reading so enjoyable in the first half of the novel disappears from that point on. Only the horror remains, along with injustices and the tyranny of officials who make absurd decisions one after the other. The narrator's state of mind goes from innocence and passion to disillusion and anger at the unfairness of it all. The coming of age angle is particularly poignant because of Meher's premature death. We can't help thinking about the fate of Anne Frank, which endows her diary with such a sense of tragedy. In the final pages, the author acknowledges the existence of such girls in Indian slums, so willing to come out of their terrible fate, who know that only knowledge and education will perhaps save them. The spirit and energy were part of her fictional characterization, and they make her death seem even more unbelievable and unfair. The full meaning of testimony as the act of gathering the surviving traces of victims arises when the reader takes the full blow of her death in the afterword. The violence of the shock is released by the embedded discourse of the book, the letters, then the news of the narrator's death, then the author's afterword, which one after the other produce a deflagration of thoughts. The notebook is what remains to bear witness. The notebook is this indispensable medium that works as a precious link in the chain of events that the historian has the task to recreate. By staging the content of the notebook as archive, the author of fiction stages the conditions of memory. In the end, Homebound is a story that leads at once to death and to communication with others. This is a line I borrowed from Michael Rosberg's traumatic realism in his study on the representation of the Holocaust from 2000, which I think perfectly applies to Homebound. In other words, it takes the death of the girl to unpack her story and share it. It doesn't really matter that the girl is a fictional creation. The author acknowledges that she has met and interviewed so many of them anyway. In fact, traumatic realism develops out of and in response to a demand for documentation that a historical event poses, especially when there's no official desire to account for the trauma. The construction of a realistic narrative is there to shape those details into a coherent story and elicit the reader's emotional response. The fact that those letters are complete and the knowledge that there will be no more, that there won't be any reply or nor any sort of consolation, make the text moving in its literal sense. To quote from Jean-Jacques Le Cercle, if there is such a thing as violence in language, the term must be taken literally, not the violence of symbol, but the violence of intervention, of an event, the immateriality of which doesn't prevent it from having material effects, effects not of metaphor, but of metamorphosis. I'd like to finish by taking a step away from that fictional family who's almost too real to be true, and away from the debate between fiction and non-fiction. The journey is strewn with references to both ancient and recent history of India. For example, the father is beaten by cops with lathis, the very weapon of the colonizers, which were, I quote, sanitized for the occasion in a humorous touch that is typical of the girl's voice. There's also this reference to the Long March of Gandhi. I quote page 24. There were three differences between the Long March and the COVID exodus. Number one, we had a bonus adversary, the virus. Number two, our destination was almost thrice as far as Bapu's. And number three, the Mahatma wanted to attract attention. We intended to avoid it. There's also this scene when migrants are confined into airless vessels, which is a grim reminder of partition imagery, where people were trapped in trains and left to die or to be burned alive. And the communal rift between Muslims and Hindus is constantly referred to. So within this lineage of events, the journey Homebound has all the attributes of a historical moment for the whole country, loaded as it is with the traumatic memory of the subcontinent. By setting her story upon the historical layer, the author also weaves the 2020 displacement wave into history books and refuses to offer any kind of redempting ending, while at the same time refusing to give up on attempts to communicate its bleak outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and compelling also a reading of Homebound. Are there any questions from the audience to start the discussion? I have a question, if I may. So one of the comparisons that was recurrent in your paper was with Anne Frank's diary, which I thought was interesting because I didn't think of Anne Frank myself when I read Homebound, so I found the comparison very interesting. I was curious, Puja, to know if Anne Frank had gone through your mind while you were writing this. And for you, Cécile, I wanted to ask whether you know, one of the things that are striking when you read Anne Frank's diary is the fact that it is in many ways a historical document, and part of the poignancy of Anne Frank comes from the fact that these events are real, and yet you, as you demonstrated, you know, Meher's letters are equally poignant, even though they are fictional. So could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Of course, there's this huge difference here. What made me think about Anne Frank is the apostrophe and this notion of an addressee somewhere, you know, and that makes it really compelling for the reader, because the reader feels this intimacy right away because of this apostrophe. So that's the reason why I thought about it. And also this universal kind of language that a teenager, a very young girl, writing in her diary. I thought it was so universal, so straightforward. Everyone can relate, you know, and that's why Anne Frank's diary is so powerful. And same here.
I've heard that comparison many times.
Oh, really?
But I don't know if I had that on my mind when I wrote it. My father was the first one who pointed it out, because he was the first one to read it. And then after that, I've heard it. And it's a huge compliment that it has the kind of impact. But I think the language is much more straightforward and much simpler and much more conversational and necessary. And this is a bit more deliberate, and she tries to sound, because she is in a way trying to show off that she knows those words. So, you know,
right, yeah.
And I felt a bit pretentious also when I wrote it, to be honest. But I wanted her to have that. I think I'm just mind blown by what you spoke about. You know, it's really very overwhelming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I had a question for you, because I was wondering if it was something you were aware of when you wrote, to stop the humorous tone at some point and to make it into something else. No, because it flowed naturally, and it gave the book a structure, or this turning point, as I said.
I think the events dictated that. And when Saleha died, I remember I cried, because those were real people who died on railway tracks. And I actually imagined a friend, a young girl, feeling it, and I remember I cried. And I think then it just flew naturally. That, because she was reacting to it, she was no longer, it was no longer her story. She was reacting to it. Oh my God, I cry so much.
It's more for Puja and also Cécile, if she wishes to answer. What about the naming of the characters? Proton, neutron, electron. What is what is it behind? What's behind it? Is it the neutral element, or is it the reactive element of the atom? Or
so she wants to be a science journalist. So she thinks with that perspective. So Proton Uncle is very positive, too optimistic all the time, annoyingly positive. So he's Proton, which has a positive charge. Auntie keeps complaining, so she's an electron, which has a negative charge. And the sun is neutral. He doesn't get into it, so it's neutral. Which has nothing to Cécile also.
Yeah, and as I said, it sounded kids-like. Kids do that all the time, like naming things in a way that we find funny or not, but naming things, finding shortcuts to you know, give a name to what to their surroundings, and
the cops also. One is a ram, one is a bull.
yeah, yeah.
Question? I guess we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.